Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, February 19th, 2025, and today we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last week or so. And as we do each week here on the Roundup on Wednesday afternoon, we take our questions we ask here from the themes we see developing in the news stories that we publish out in our newsletter that comes out Monday mornings. That's called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And in case you're wondering, SMIE Consulting, that's the name of the company, Social Media and International Education Consulting. That is what the theme of the newsletter is. It comes in two forms, either via email that you subscribe to through our website at smieconsulting.org/subscribe, where you can get the email version of this newsletter in your inbox at 9 a.m. Eastern every Monday. Or if you prefer, we have a LinkedIn version as well, where if that's where you get your news, international ed news, certainly between the two, the email and the LinkedIn version, we now have 2,500 subscribers. We just crossed that threshold this past week. Very excited that so many international educators are making the newsletter, all the SMIE News Fit to Share, part of their international edification each week. We have 4 sections in that newsletter. One that's social media news that can cover everything from how social media is being leveraged to reach international students, upcoming webinars, topics on AI, international data, all those kinds of resources that you can only find in the digital space. That's one topic area. We also have a roundup of what's happening in the United States, and that could include top news stories and nowadays new executive orders that might be impacting what we do in international ed. We also have a section on solutions. We're all about solutions at SMIE Consulting, trying to identify ways that and ideas that might be able to be changed or adapted at your institution to improve what you're doing internationally. And finally, we have a global roundup where we take a look at what's happening in international ed topics in different countries around the world. Not only our major competitors, UK, Canada, Australia, Australia, the 3 main ones, and then other English-speaking destinations, but increasingly other nations around the world that are trying to become international ed hubs for their countries. So we look at all of those because it's important to have a perspective on what's going on in the wider world around us when it comes to global student mobility. And we'll touch on those topics and share how that perspective might improve what we do here in the United States. So those are the topics we cover in the newsletter. We see themes generally coming up in a number of news stories each week, and then we translate those into questions that we can go next level on here on Wednesdays. You get our hot takes on Mondays in the newsletter, and then 3 of the themes will go into some more solution-oriented approaches and identifying the kind of the key pain points and solutions we have to maybe adjusting how we do what we do to make the world a little bit more understandable for not only ourselves, but for our superiors at our institutions, senior leadership that need to understand the greater landscape of how international ed issues are affecting not only the United States, but around the world. So let's get right into the first question of the day, and that is, what are the issues facing the new international student? Now, a lot has been written, surveys have been done, and today, in about an hour, I'm going to be presenting be a part of a panel with 3 other international educators in the United States. That the panel will be moderated by Karen Fisher of the Chronicle, and they'll be answering this basic question: the issues facing the new international student. And one of the things that we're going to be covering in that are 3 main issues: adapting to the new wave of budget-conscious international students, understanding the challenges that lie ahead for international students, and finally, finding opportunities for growth during this redefining tumultuous period. And obviously, Trump administration 2.0 and all the executive orders are going to be top of the list, but also more broadly speaking, how does how do international students that are looking at the United States navigate the various challenges to come here, but also how do they pick us in the first place? What are the defining issues? And that's what I'll be talking about. Some of the larger issues globally that we need to be aware of in terms of helping international students navigate these challenges. So that's what we're going to be talking about in broad strokes at 2 p.m. today. And the link to that registration page for the webinar is in the chat. So please do join us if you're not already registered for that event. It's going to be shortly after we finish. We'll have about a half-hour break to grab some lunch if you haven't eaten already, and attend that live webinar that Karen Fisher at the Chronicle will be moderating, and that'll be supported in part by Keystone Education Group, so one of the larger lead generation sources for international student recruitment initiatives. So when I think about what is the new international student, this is a student that has part of their schooling, particularly whether secondary or university level studies, was completed during the pandemic, that they are increasingly budget conscious. They are increasingly focused, if not themselves, their parents, on outcomes. What are the jobs that their son or daughter can get for the $250,000 or more that their families will be investing in their child's education to come study in the United States. There are topics of how do I go through that visa process? What do I believe? There's a lot of hyperbole out there, a lot of rhetoric that's being tossed around, but what is the actual policy changes that affect me as an international student, a prospective international student, as I'm looking at the United States? I think what we know for certain, our campuses have always been welcoming environments for international students. Going back to Trump 1.0, we saw the rise of the You Are Welcome Here campaign, which we could probably do with again, particularly if any of these executive orders actually lead to negative consequences in terms of new students coming into the United States, in terms of visa access, that type of thing. But we saw back then, we saw a time where there was great upheaval because of the Muslim travel bans that were implemented by the first Trump administration, even though only 5 of those 7 countries were Muslim majority. You had North Korea and Venezuela thrown in there as well. So we're looking at what the rhetoric is versus what the actual policy implementations were. Even with those travel bans, we saw that there were exemptions carved out for students, so that even though visas would not be issued from those 7 countries, and that was largely because we weren't getting reciprocal access to databases in those countries to be able to vet properly those students. We had all these international databases on criminals and terrorists and all these other things to track individuals that are applying for our visas, but we didn't have the local country knowledge in these 7 countries, so that's why they were on the visa ban list. But even given that, exemptions were carved out for students, and when these all were challenged in the courts, those bans were all overturned because they were overreaches by the federal government. The problem is that the rhetoric that surrounded those bans, and this is on the heels of the campaign and the very much anti-immigrant rhetoric that was portrayed in 2016 during the election season. And then when President Trump took office, then those policies really started to take shape. So for students back coming in during the first Trump administration, there were some legitimate roadblocks, but the lion's share of hesitation was due to just public relations kind of nightmares, because as international student recruitment officers and international education officers on campus, we were trying to in damage control mode for most of that 4 years and leading up to COVID and the pandemic, which was Trump's final year in office, where there obviously was a downturn that only in the last year have we recovered from. Significantly above where we were pre-pandemic. So Trump 2.0, there's a lot of factors impacting students that are looking at the United States. They didn't go through what Trump 1.0 students went through, unless they have older siblings. But they know the rhetoric is similar. But there have been distinctions drawn, though not as clearly as we might like from an international education perspective, on what the Trump administration calls illegal immigration. And God knows we've had an open border for the last 4 years, and that's changed. That is being sealed off. The Remain in Mexico policy is being reinstated. That there's the number of captures and gotaways is down 90% or more from the last 4 years of the Biden administration. So there's significant progress being made in that, and that was a campaign promise he made, and frankly, that's one of the main reasons he was elected, to deal with the immigration issue. The problem has been with the implementation of some of these things, where the claims were that seem to bleed over from anybody who's here without documentation. That is what scares the bejesus out of campuses where we have large concentrations of undocumented students, where there may be students who have come to us through refugee or asylee categories or legitimate student categories. We think, well, international students are next. So, but the evidence isn't there yet to say that they're going to be targeted specifically. What has been targeted directly, and what we can say is a real issue we have to deal with now, are the students that were involved in protests against Israel, those that were arrested, those that were espousing pro-Hamas or pro-terrorist organization views. Those are, and if they're convicted of those crimes, they can legitimately be removed from the country, and will be removed from the country if that conviction if those convictions happen. And there's one case of a Chinese student in California that was recently had their visa revoked. Is that a concern? And those will say it's free speech, but well, there are cases that will be made, and those will be challenged in the courts as well. But the reality is, when students are convicted of crimes, not just arrested, but those that are convicted of crimes can lose visa status, not just protest in this particular case, but if they have done, there's been, depending on the level of crime, there are cases in the past where students from, say, the Middle East who come on a government scholarship and they end up getting in trouble. There's DWIs or other bodily harm kind of issues, those types of things. They can lose their visa's status and be sent home. Sometimes the consulates or embassies act preemptively and remove them before that becomes an issue, but those criminal convictions can lead to the removal of an international student because they violated their visa status. They're here as guests. They are not immigrants. They are on a non-immigrant visa, and they do not have permanent rights to do whatever they want, whenever they want. They're subject to the laws of the United States, and one of those laws is, as an international student on a certain visa status, if you do things that violate your status, you can be removed. So that can and will happen. It's being used as a free speech case, but if you have students that are espousing terrorist views, they can be considered a threat to national security by espousing those views. And that's the view of the government, and that is something that has and will lead to expulsions of students from institutions, and that would be a reason why a student would have to be removed as well if they're expelled from a university because of such conduct. That's all out there. So many in our field, international education, would probably show sympathy towards the Palestinian cause. Now, does sympathy toward the Palestinian cause, if you espouse that as a student and participate in protests, is that a direct violation of their status? No. But when you're espousing views that are held by terrorist organizations or actively showing support for those terrorist organizations, that is a violation. And that is something that even if you're a U.S. citizen, you could get in trouble by associating yourself with a terrorist organization. This is still the post 9/11 world, where those are real issues that our government deals with on a regular basis. And there are Americans who have been arrested, sent to Gitmo, which some of these illegal immigrants coincidentally are being sent, the worst of the worst. So these are the things that we're dealing with as international educators, and it touches us somewhat in terms of the policies that are being implemented. But the one that is, there's also been the pauses on funding for government grants, and that's affecting programming overseas. USAID obviously has had huge challenges with their staffing because of the actions of the Trump administration. That's impacting programming in certain countries, and will have long-term implications, negative implications, our loss of soft power as a result. Once all the fraud, and believe me, there's fraud in USAID, and it's shining a light on something then at USAID, but it's not, USAID is not alone. It's the whole government, whether you agree or not with Doge and the efforts to root out fraud and waste in the government. These are not new calls. It's the first time that perhaps it's gotten as much visibility and notice and actually court backing for allowing the Doge effort to access certain information in federal government employees and processes to help identify where the waste is. Some are calling it a witch hunt, and some are calling it McCarthyism 2.0 in terms of if you're not with the government, you're against us. But it's kind of the opposite, really, in terms of rooting out problems. But all of these are being latched onto by certain elements of the media, certain folks in our international community that feel threatened by the constant barrage of executive orders, and a lot of it is, I think, PTSD from the first Trump administration in terms of what's actually going to happen. We don't know all the concrete ways that we are going to be impacted directly as a result of these actions. Some of them are in these review periods, like for extreme vetting for visas, which we've talked about here on the Roundup before. There's a 60 or 90 day pause, or not pause, but review period, where similar to the first term, where they put in the travel bans, this time they're being a little bit more circumspect to make sure they have better legal foundation to implement any any restrictions on visa access for audiences abroad. Some of that's coming, and there may be pieces of that impact international students. But more than anything else, I think aside from the politics, aside from what we talked about earlier, the outcomes piece, I'll talk about that in one of our later topics today. One of the other things we need to do as institutions is cut through the noise as much as we can, and work with our current students, because right now I know on our campus at University of Akron, we are here. There are students that have come back from the holidays, who started new in the spring, that have some real fears because of all these stories that they're hearing in the press. And they're getting worried. Are they going to be targeted? Are they don't want to step out of line, and they want to make sure they're maintaining status, which it's a negative reinforcement of what we want them to do anyways. How to maintain your status has never been a more important orientation session than it is right now. Talking about, we do daily news bulletins out of our international center, manages our current international students, to them to update them on policy changes, on what documents you should keep with you when you're on campus, what to do if an ICE officer comes on campus to interview students, whatever the case may be. All of that are kinds of issues we're having to deal with. So anyone in your ISSS offices on your campuses, they're likely doing the same thing. So it's damage control, but it's also trying to calm fears, getting them to breathe, and be constructive in terms of the advice that you're giving. Obviously, you may have your own fears about where this is going, but right now, all we can do is say, here's what the law says, here's what the best advice that we have to give is, and please know that we are here to make sure we do everything to help you stay in status. And so you're the resource. You're not an agent of the government in terms of your role. Yes, you have to share data. Yes, that is a requirement for every university in the United States that has international students enrolled. But the key factor is, I think we all need to just breathe and really try and step back as much as we can to understand the real issues that are impacting our students, not just the ones that are on campus, but the ones that are potentially coming to us, because they are the ones that will determine how successful we are in the days and weeks to come. So really meaty topic. Really encourage you to tune in at 2 p.m. Eastern today. Again, the links to that registration page are in the chat. Please get signed up for that so you can become a part of the conversation. Next question of the day is, what will the globally mobile student landscape look like in 2030? And this is one that we're all in the business of forecasting, if not for our own benefits and our office's benefit, for our senior leadership on campus. They want to know, hey, what's the future going to look like for international students coming to the United States? But what I always point colleagues to, particularly senior leadership to, is some of the bigger picture issues, like I try and share every week, is look at the global perspective, what's going on. Our friends at IIE, those are the ones that do the Open Doors report through funding from the ECA at State Department. They've been doing that for decades. They also do a lot of forecasting in recent years. They've worked on Project Atlas, which combines companies, organizations, governmental bodies like Open Doors in the United States or from other nations to try and get a global picture of globally mobile students. IIE has released their Outlook 2030 brief on the U.S. and international education. Some really insightful data in here and some very positive data, and we all could use some positivity these days. But big headlines from this article, from this report. By 2030, the number of internationally mobile students will grow from 6 million, where it was in 2023, to over 10 million. So that's an increase of 4 million in less than 7 years. And as much as, here's the kicker here, as much as 1/5 of that number, 20%, will come to the United States. So that's 2 million students potentially by 2030. 2 million international students. We're at a little over 1.1 million now, depending on which resource you're checking. So that is huge. It's the United States' 5th largest export industry, international education, in case you weren't aware. It used to be 6th and we're up to 5th, so that's good news. But having that kind of number, you can put on your bulletin boards and say, hey, the U.S. could have almost double the number of international students in the next 7 years. How is that even possible, you might ask? So one of the reasons for that is we've seen over the last 2 years countries that have been our primary competition for internationally mobile students, the greater majority of them, Australia, Canada, UK, have all had issues internally in their countries that have forced their governments to restrict international student access to their countries. In the UK, it was first the dependent study visa ban, where if you were doing a master's degree or a bachelor's degree, you could not bring dependents with you. And that reduced those numbers dramatically in key markets like India and Nigeria, and reduced interest in those two key markets. You've seen in Canada, they were pushing 1 million international students as a combination of post-secondary bachelor's, master's, doctoral programs, as well as vocational training, which had almost 600,000 students in vocational training at one point in Canada. So the higher ed numbers are only about 300 to 400,000, but for vocational training they were huge. And there were a lot of abuses, a lot of unregulated. It was a very unregulated industry in terms of access and public-private partnerships between vocational colleges in certain provinces in BC, Ontario, and Quebec, especially where the lion's share of Canadian international students or international students in Canada go. That led to some institutions having 80-90% of their, on the private side, 80-90% or more of their student body being international. That were Canada had made itself open and welcoming to international students as a way to help meet skills gaps in their labor force. and from certain countries, particularly India, that was a huge pipeline. And so for direct access to work, you would have students who already had master's degrees in India coming to do vocational degrees for 2 or 3 years that allowed them entry into the Canadian workforce and then eventually residency. So that created a lot of pressures on health services, on transportation, on housing in key areas around the country, and that led to the government saying, well, hold on a minute, we've gone too far, we need to step back and start restricting. So they introduced a 25% cap in the first year, an additional 10% this next year. The actual results have been far worse. The reputational damage done in certain markets, particularly India, has led to a 45% drop in study permit applications by students. So that's been a major issue. Australia, similar challenges on the vocational side, limited number of places. So they've had similar housing challenges, services challenges that Canada and the UK have had. So all of that has impacted the ability for our other main competitors to absorb more international students. We can do it. We have the capacity. We're only at 6% of our higher education enrollment is international now. In the UK, Canada, and Australia, you're looking at 22% minimally at their university level study, 30% in Canada. It's way higher at the vocational level. Australia, 24%. Again, these are just university level classes, not vocational. We're at 6. So those numbers show that capacity-wise, we have it, whereas our major competition doesn't. You also see numbers on how important international students are for the U.S. economy and jobs here. They support over 368,000 jobs, international students in the United States, 368,000 jobs. That's a huge driver. $40 billion in revenue from the international students' contributions to the United States academically. From their presence, you see that there's a desire. 92% of institutions in the United States say that they expect to increase their international enrollments over the next 5 years, so they have a desire to grow. You also see international students coming to the U.S. from every world region. Certainly no one is immune from the charms in certain ways of the United States. But our numbers are still growing. We're back over where we were pre-pandemic. There have only been 2 major dips in the last 50 years, coming post 9/11 in 2003, 4, and 5, 6, and then in the 22, 23, 24, 25, 22, 23, 23, 24 academic years, we're back up on a strong upward trend now, and looking for that to continue. So the IIE report really does help, I think, give you a great look at what's happening and is likely to happen in 2030, and why we're the best positioned country to take advantage of that. And this does not discount a lot of the regional hubs that are developing: Hong Kong, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Gulf. India is even trying to join that crowd. But you also see other countries like Vietnam, Thailand attracting more students from East Asia, from China especially. So there are others it's becoming a much more crowded marketplace for international students to choose from, and which is great for them. But it just means we have to work that much harder to make sure our message is getting through the noise. Now, let's get on to our final question of the day. And is the connection between study and work the most important piece of a successful international student recruitment puzzle? And I say absolutely. Kind of going back to what we talked about earlier about the new issues facing international students today. The post-pandemic rush, student surveys across the board have identified career outcomes and employment data as the big driver of why they choose to study in a particular country at a particular university. And that means that's at the end of our student journey, right? We get these students attracted to us through our websites, through our reputation, through other things. We have had survey after survey showing that that's the issue that we need to be addressing. But how many of our career offices, other than the standard line of, well, 80% of our students get jobs or find employment or continue on with graduate studies, within 6 months of graduation. Every institution has that kind of a stat. But how many of you have data at your institutions that speak specifically to international student data in terms of access? How many of them get OPT? What are the kinds of jobs that they get? What is their success rate? What are their average starting salaries? All of that are relevant data that you should hopefully get and make available to your future students in the recruitment process. Because if you can do that, and you can also supplement that with anecdotal stories of the students that are really, who have become success stories, recent grads, international grads that have gotten jobs at great companies, noteworthy places. If you can supplement that with the data that shows starting salaries, shows employment rates, shows OPT success rates, all of that is going to help you better recruit the next generation of students. So most of our institutions, we focus so much on getting them in the door and taking care of them in that first year, we lose sight of that end product, which is really what we need to focus on. And this came up this week. IGP released a new white paper called "Understanding U.S. Labor Shortages," or actually, it's actually called "Connecting Industry and Education: International Talent as a Solution to the U.S. Labor Shortage." And this is a topic, great data in here from IDP. Don't have time to go into all of it right away, but definitely worth getting that for your office and for your senior leadership on campus. And this is something that we really are focusing on at Akron these days with what I'm doing is generating the success stories and that data that I was talking about and those anecdotals of testimonials that we can gather from our international grads to show, hey, we are doing a good job. We are getting students placed in the right industries, in the right jobs, and here are some of their success stories. Having that to share with future students and their parents is gold, recruitment gold. And the more you can mine that, the better prepared you are to recruit the next generation of students to your campus. So that's all we have for you this week on the Roundup. We appreciate you being a part of the conversation today, and do be sure to just check out the live webinar that the Chronicle is hosting at the top of the hour. Looking forward to chatting with you then, and if you're not already subscribed to the podcast version of this Roundup, audio only, you can get that on all your favorite podcast providers. So until next time, thanks very much. Cheers.